All right. Can everybody hear me now? Great. Okay, so welcome to everyone in the room with us and to the many people joining us online from around the world. I'm Kristen O'Planick from USAID's Bureau for Food Security, and I'll be facilitating today's program. Although, just to put it out there, I'm feeling a little under the weather. If I need to step out, my dear friend Andrew is going to step in. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so we are so glad to have you here for this special Marketlinks event on the realities of co-creating with the private sector. For those of us in the room, please take a moment to silence your phone and just be mindful of noise. We are recording the webinar portion. Today's event will contain two parts. First, we will have our panel discussion, drawing from field experiences in 3 different market contexts. After that, we will have to say farewell to our online friends as we move to an in-person only roundtable discussion to delve deeper into how USAID can better operationalize this type of co-creation in the field. We will be gathering notes from the roundtable and producing a summary document that will be shared on Marketlinks with all of the other post-event resources. So for those online and who didn't make it into in the room space, you will have an opportunity to see that information. So let's get to it. Co-creation with the private sector is a challenge, but essential to success in market systems development activities. And with USAID's still fairly new private sector engagement policy, we are even more attentive now to how we approach our engagement within market systems activities. This is perhaps the most localized and most nuanced private sector engagement within the USAID portfolio, and the co-creation processes might look different than what we'd see within multinational circles. So we need to be open to how to contextualize and localize our engagement modalities. We are fortunate to have with us today 3 chiefs of party whose activities are effectively navigating the combination of co-creation, collaboration, learning and adapting, or CLA, market systems facilitation, and private sector engagement. That's quite a mouthful. It seems like quite a lot to take on. But they've learned some useful things along the way, which they're going to share with us today. And most importantly, from a market systems perspective, is this idea of shifting mindsets around what it means to co-create with the private sector. And let's be clear, the co-creating that we are talking about here is not just a process to come to an agreement, but much more. Now, to briefly introduce our speakers, their full bios are on the screen and posted on Marketlinks. You can check those out later. Luca Credelli is the Chief of Party of the Feed the Future Mozambique Agricultural Innovations Activity, also known as INNOVA, implemented by DAI. He is a market systems expert with more than 16 years of experience providing analysis and advice to the government and the private sector for the development of inclusive markets in Africa, Asia, and Europe. He has worked with a variety of donors across more than 14 countries. Fun fact, he previously served as an economic advisor to the president of Tanzania and as team leader for Enable in Nigeria, the first project to use the market systems approach to stimulate business environment reform. How old are you, Luca? Anyway. Marcos Moreno, until recently, was the chief of party of the Feed the Future Uganda Youth Leadership for Agriculture activity implemented by Comonix, which closes this July. He is an agriculture and youth development expert with more than 25 years of experience creating sustainable economic opportunities for the next generation via agribusiness development projects in East Africa, Southern Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Throughout his career, he's combined agricultural knowledge with innovative business expertise to link private and public sector resources to benefit target populations, including youth and women, create viable market-driven economic opportunities along key value chains, and promote sustainable skills and strengthen livelihoods. And finally, Sergio Rivas is the chief of party of USAID's Transforming Market Systems, implemented by ACDI VOCA. Since joining ACDI VOCA in 2008, he has served as chief of party for USAID-funded projects in Paraguay and Colombia. Prior to this, he was a senior evaluator at Management Systems International and a certified USAID contracting officers representative and agreement officers representative. He has worked in Peru, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Some highlights in there. In 2015, the project he managed in Colombia received the Order of Democracy Simón Bolívar, the highest possible civilian distinction awarded by the Colombian Congress for its services to the Afro-Colombia population. So with that, Luca, over to you.
It's actually happening. Okay, hi. Good morning, everyone. So we don't have much time for each one of us, so I will jump into it. Just for reference, Innova is a 5 years program. We work in agriculture. We're based in Mozambique, and we're about halfway of our life. There's more information around if you want to know more about the project itself. I wanted to bring your attention to, there's a part in the private sector engagement strategy that I particularly like. Well, in the introduction, I think, that is saying that we need to move to a position where we will be steering more than rowing, meaning nudging the private sector and leave the ownership with the private sector to improve on their journey of self-reliance. And I want to bring that perspective a little bit to the reality of doing things in the field as well, because I do empathize with that proposition. However, I do think that we need to be conscious that co-creation is, or creation is, a way to kickstart the engine of growth somehow. So it's not something that is going to lead us to a new equilibrium, but is rather something that leads us to disequilibrium. It leads us to a process of continuous growth with the partners that we're working. So what we really want to see is partners that invest into becoming better and become more competitive, and therefore grow and include more smallholder farmers, in the case of Mozambique, into the market by providing them with services at better price, at better quality, making access easier for them, and as well as buying from them. So the way we relate to private sector partners, at least in the way we have been relating as Innova, which I think has been an innovation for me, is to really focus on those capacities for organic organizational growth. And that obviously leads us to privilege metrics that are qualitative in nature, that, for example, gear towards measuring the number of relationships, the quality of relationships in the market, whether these relationships build value for all the parties, whether the company is autonomously improving and changing over time. Because for a country to be self-reliant, we need that country to be more capable of continuing innovation and narrowing the gap, if you want, over time. So it's a dynamic perspective that I want to bring, and that's the first takeaway. So, oh yeah, the clicker. Yeah. So if, I don't think it's working. It's more than a slide. Yes. So that's the first slide. And the second slide is, so the first point is, how do we select the right partners? The right partners are not necessarily the largest partners in the market. They're not necessarily the ones that have the right technology, but we want to identify the disruptors. We want to identify those that are committed to do business as unusual, and that they can kickstart that engine. And you want to be partnering with them, obviously, considering where their position is in the market, in the sense that the networks that they have, the capacity that they have to generate replication and imitation across the market, or to build more relationships with other supporting functions. So to be a lever for a broader change. And then you start negotiating the partnership. This is a little bit of an adaptation of the AARE model from Springfield. Obviously, is an adaptation by me, as you can see from the handwriting. But I think that the adopt, adapt, respond, and expand, which basically quickly means that on adopting and adapting, you're working directly with an individual partner, helping the partner adopt a new innovation and then adapting it for his own functions and capacities and so on. And then respond is the responses you get in the market by the non-competitors, so by either your customers that buy more of your products or supporting functions that support you. So it's a part of the crowding in that is not by your competitors trying to compete with you, and then expand is ultimately the competitors that are joining in. But I think that the original model is quite static, while we are really focused on those feedback loops that generate further innovation. So on how your supporting functions help you to learn more about your customer base, for example, and continue to provide services and so on. So you engage the partner at one of these entry points. All of these entry points are possible ways to start negotiating are possible deal notes. I add aware in the sense that a lot of partners maybe do not have enough evidence or do not know enough to be able to commit themselves to change. So a lot of the role of the programs are about building that awareness for increased commitment to change in kickstarting that engine. But otherwise, you would typically have a deal note. We do not have grants in Innova, so we negotiate flexible deal notes that are supports in kind, either TA or cost sharing for innovation and testing. So your adoption and adoption are then the typical kind of supports we would provide to a partner. Then here is where things start to be chaotic, because our experience tells us, I mean, it's like discovering hot water maybe, but our experience tells us that in thin markets, obviously you have a lack of services and supports for companies to be able to continue innovate. So you tend to have companies that are very personalized. It's like capitalism with a face, if you want. You don't operate with strong organizations, but rather organizations that pivot around individual entrepreneurs. And if you're lucky enough to strike a deal with an innovative entrepreneur that has a vision and has that commitment, you will need to deal with that personality and that capacity of learning. Like the learning and the organizational learning is actually almost non-existent. It pivots around an individual person. And that individual person, like entrepreneurs that are successful, are often experts and fanatics at the same time. So they are expert because they know they live the experience of the enterprise on their own skin. So their learning is experiential, is based on what they see and touch. And they are fanatics because they often are over-optimistic. They are very hardworking and often over-optimistic with what they can achieve or the changes that can happen. So there's a clash in culture between a project like ours. We have adopted a lot of innovative and flexible tools, like our partnership mechanism is very flexible. I've given around a handout that speaks about that, and we had a couple of blogs on Marketlinks as well that explain that. Our MELD plan is very flexible. We have abandoned the rigidity of results chain to move to a concept of probes, and we're very flexible at that level as well. However, we still need to be able to negotiate sitting around the table based on some level of evidence and clarity on what is the next step. While the culture typically is impatient in terms of, we know it's going to work, we just want to get on and do it. And then we will see. So an evaluation and learning that happens almost post-mortem, if you want, ex post. Therefore, that often, if you want, often has a higher probability of failure as well in the learning process that we would be prepared to accept. So I think this is another takeaway I would like to give in terms of the nature of how organizations in thin markets or in markets where enterprise is very personalized, how that learning happens and how you build your capacity to interact with that way of learning, given where you're coming from and our need to be based on data. Data before we plan or imagine the change, and data to measure the change and adapt. So a lot of that effort, the private sector, even if they see the value of it, they are not prepared or culturally able to take. So yeah, that's my point. So I just wanted to give you an example. Well, this is an example I often use because I'm quite excited about the changes that this is bringing to Mozambique. So building on previous efforts from USAID as well, we have been working for quite some time with a large input distributor, relatively speaking, and getting larger, and to help really to build up their footprint in the country and make access easier to the smallholder farmers. So stop being focused on winning government contracts or NGO contracts for distribution of inputs, or selling to a number of agro dealers thinking that they are their clients, to moving to thinking that actually the clients are the farmers and the agro dealer is just a way to distribute. So we need to build more value. We need to make it more accessible for farmers to buy. So it's a Copernican change for a company of that kind. And so we start negotiating. First of all, the first phase was building awareness. So we took them around the country. They were not very convinced. They had a strategic position in the market. We did village days where they were in touch for the first time with the smallholder farmers themselves. And they figured that actually there was more demand than they expected. So there's some level of latent demand out there. And no research would have, no evidence brought to them unless they had experienced that themselves, would have moved them to the next stage. And then starting to negotiate on what we call probe, which are those green things in terms of what are the individual changes we want to put in place, and we want to measure to see whether they work. And then obviously this blossomed into to build also the efficiency and the volumes. You need to also solve the pain points of the manufacturers so you have more stuff in your trucks, and then you can push it further into the last mile and so on. So from a point of view of a corporate and of a company, a very interesting and exciting journey as a first mover. And so refer to the 2 points I was making before. First, in terms of dynamism, there's often the question that these are the first movers. They receive, at the end of the day, quite a bit of support from the project, not in forms of financing. We don't have a grant fund, but hand-holding in this process. Are we picking winners? And then the point is that if you think in dynamic terms, that advantage that a company captures is actually the engine for growth and destructive creation, if you want, from almost a Schumpeterian point of view. You want to have that initial rent for the company to capture to be able to continue grow. And then competition is generated by catching up and then putting pressure to local retailers as well to provide better services and so on and so forth. Secondly, from an experiential point of view, some of these probes, some of these innovations are faster at taking place because the entrepreneur is convinced that this may work, and others are slower, not because the entrepreneur has not bought into them, but it's just they become less relevant or less important for the strategic vision that he may have. And therefore, the level of effort in analyzing data or modifying or pivoting is much slower. And that means that we need to have a lot of adaptability based on our plans or based on our reporting that takes that into account. So, yeah. So there's a few takeaways that I just wanted to offer at the beginning of this. And in terms of the realities of dealing with the process of learning in a private sector context where you have individual enterprises.
Thank you, Luca. So, good morning. YLA is a 5-year design that started in 2016 and ends, as Christine had pointed, in July 2020. And YLA is set to reach 350,000 youth in a career path in agriculture. However, we quickly found out that the only way to succeed in this is in partnership with private sector. And it's actually private sector who needs to engage youth. Our activity reaches 350, but private sector is responsible in engaging. So I want to make sure that I point to that flip of words because we commonly get confused in who needs to engage. And we design and we work towards an activity that's all thought out. But if we ignore exactly who actually we're working to benefit and who we need to actually partner with, we tend to lose focus on the how to do this. And one of the things that allowed us to actually learn that is by understanding that we're constantly trying to adapt, to manage, to improve. And at the center of YLA's approach is the concept of adaptive management, which is a rigorous learning process that allows YLA to build on successes, learn from failures, and make timely evidence-based course corrections, which I think Luca had pointed to improve outcomes. And one of the most fundamental processes in adaptive management, and I guess I'm happy to hear that that is a key element, is the pivot. The idea that successful entrepreneurs and businesses change directions based on evidence or new information, but they stay grounded in what they have learned. Over time, pivoting may lead an activity from their original set of interventions to new ones, but with the common threads that link each iteration to its foundational principles and contractual objectives. And within this approach, there are several key themes that emerged as success factors that have allowed YLA to constantly evolve and pivot in response to the needs of private sector, while also promoting sustainability and inclusion. And you know, this pivot is something that, if we take the time frame of an activity, we've learned to actually see where those pivots occur and at what frequency these pivots are occurring. And I'll touch base on this a little bit further in our guiding principles. And again, you know, these guiding principles have allowed YLA to focus on this adaptive management intervention and include the principle of walking the talk, which it reinforces the concept that YLA can have the most impact on achieving transformational results when it leads by example. And the principle of designing in reverse, which is more really connected to co-creation, recognizes that sustainability does not happen by accident. So YLA, by understanding that, has focused particularly on the needs of the YLA partners to work and promote lasting results. And when we're talking about, design in reverse, there are four key aspects that work in letting this principle play out. One is letting demand set the agenda. Whose demand? And paying attention to actually the partner itself and the community to define really what are those business needs and identify the resources to meet those needs. We commonly ask our partners, what's holding you back? And shift from really being so prescriptive on telling them, this is what's holding you back. And when we allow ourselves to ask that question, we can quickly identify exactly where are those bottlenecks that can unlock through a quick in, quick out approach, the solution that the private sector needs and not necessarily what a project needs. So the second one is empowering partners to grow their networks. Private partners are continuously adapting, innovating, pivoting to scale their businesses. And as partners grow in that direction, they also do so by connecting to new partners, which will in turn grow their networks, while they facilitates that continuous growth by providing matchmaking services. Literally, we learned earlier on that the true nature of YLA is a sophisticated dating service for agriculture. So, and one thing that we learned also was, again, that came from, as a Feed the Future activity, the shift from trying to establish boundaries based on, you know, districts that are focused districts, and understanding that private sector doesn't operate within a set boundary. They operate within a business and these business corridors that actually you need to be able to pay attention to be able to promote a market systems model. So the big ticket item here was being able to pivot from a donor-centric, partner-driven design that avails opportunity for the activity to play a stronger facilitative role by adding value, not funding, through partnership agreements that significantly leverage private sector efforts rather than perpetuating a donor funding mindset. And as businesses perform better, they will be better prepared to sustainably engage youth at scale as key actors in the market system. And the market system is the result of a critical mass of these private sector partners sustainably growing and generating more options for youth in agriculture, and with networks multiplying and interacting with themselves. Walking the talk, key. We cannot emphasize that, if with the strength of this market system lies by leading by example. And it starts with YLA being that catalyst for innovation in the agriculture sector so that we can influence the way in which the actors that we engage work. And by walking the talk, we're trying to demonstrate the skills and the behaviors that we want our partners to emulate, and that our staff are well trained actually with the skills and behavior patterns that they need to use to make this successful. So we strive to empower staff to be these business mentor to our partners. That required actually making sure that our staff understood well what private sector is and how do they operate. And we found early on that we needed to make sure that they had those skills in place. Efficiency in the deal cycle. We expect efficiency from private sector. And if we can't have an efficient process itself, something as simple as putting a grant out, if it takes 4 months to actually use that tool to move things, we're not being very efficient, and we're expecting the partner to do so. And to be able to be efficient, you actually have to invest in putting the right tools in place. And we were discussing this earlier with Sergio, is how do you manage an activity, that has 5 regional offices with staff scattered if you don't have the right tools and the visibility that we need to basically work in partnership with private sector. Well, private sector has the same challenge. Supply chains actually work the same way. Is how do you actually make sure that private sector has the right tools to do this? And lastly, to engage youth, and you see that we're calling this WOOT. The reality of YLA's challenge is that 350,000 youth that private sector needs to engage. By design, we agreed that it was very important to actually focus on the women youth. And we have an aggressive target of 70% women engaged in agriculture. So the reality is, YLA is not an activity about youth, it's an activity about WOOT. So to do that, to actually add that element of and that gender perspective, we have to work with private sector, supporting them to build the business case for youth inclusion. It's not as easy as just the adding factor of how many women. It's actually helping private sector understand what is the value when you pay attention to gender, and move beyond equality and participation rates to focus on the quality of how youth participate and bolster female leadership in agriculture. And more importantly, to do that, again, you have to invest in your staff so that they're equipped and incentivized to promote inclusion. Now, at the heart of that, you actually cannot succeed if you don't understand how to fail and see opportunity in failing. So I want to leave you with a couple of lessons learned here that we quickly understood, and it's the failure to critically understand the partner and their business model, which made us go back to the drawing board and rethink how to improve the quality of our interactions with the partners to get involved, to get the information that we need and not the other way around. We need to be able to know how to talk about the intervention design with the partners. That's where the co-creation part comes into play. So it is clear that the intervention is not YLA or project focused, but rather focused on the specific partner need, a value add proposition. And again, I can't stress this enough about stop thinking and trying to force that mindset on the partner that we as a donor are here to fund them. If what funding is required, the private sector needs to go to the bank. We're not necessarily the best tool for that. We do have resources, but the resources that we use are set to add value. The failure of proactive involvement in the grant to identifying issues early on. Not everything that we touch turns into gold. So we need to be able to accelerate the decision-making process quickly and understand really where our partners are struggling or where, and recognize where we actually have the wrong partner. And then I think, Luca, you talked to about this is, where are you, private sector partner? And that's the bigger question, is how do you find the right partner? And it does take some hits and misses, but you do need to pay attention to quickly be able to identify the private sector and lock them in and take advantage of their ability then to work step by step by paying attention to the pivots. The failure to recognize low partner capacity to achieve targets on schedule, and you need to empower partners and build upon their resilience rather than being their auditors. You need to be able to share knowledge and know-how with partners, by partners through partner-led forums and reflection events like FailFest, and you have to help them recognize their own roadblocks and pain points. So while they shifted from a mindset of auditor and knower of the truth and focused on mitigating failures or predetermining interventions to mentor and learn in a learner-focused approach on identifying solutions that add value and learning from failures. And failure to support partner pivots can also result in stunted progress, slow growth, and lack of sustainability. You need to recognize and embrace the partner pivots quickly. Businesses are much more agile than a project, and you need to pay attention to be able to draw on the skills that businesses bring. You need to listen to the partner in meetings and monitor regularly to identify when they shift in direction. That's the pivot. And they pivot much faster than we as an activity tend to have the capacity to pivot. The failure to engage youth who need the most and are benefiting the least. You have to help make the business case for youth engagement and create avenues to maximize this engagement. By having empathy and the will to help and inspire other women is not necessarily inherent for some businesses, including female business owners, which WILE has partnered with. And so WILE has been trying to apply, different types of tools and forums to make sure that we have a better opportunity to build the business case for youth and WOOth. We have to focus on the diffused impact, on how the outcome of the work can be used to inspire other women by ensuring that other communities, men and women, know what these women have achieved. And I will end it with that and pass it on to Sergio. That many years ago.
Thank you, Marcos. So hopefully this section will complement nicely what Luca and Marcos just shared with us. Remember what Luca said, finding disruptors. And what Marcos just presented was pivoting over time. And that's very important. We're going to talk about the transforming market systems activity in Honduras. This is the youngest of the three activities. We started in 2018. We have about a year and a half of implementation now. It's a 5-year program designed to create jobs in Honduras. We had a first initial inception phase in which we were allowed to experiment and engage public and private actors thoroughly and find out what were their pain points. And this allowed us to learn a lot. But two things came out very clearly. One is that there was a vast and diverse world of actors there, public and private entities beyond the usual suspects. Usually you think about the one association, the one municipality, the one entity or service provider or whatnot. Truth is, as we always say, but don't really realize, reality is complex and it's messy. The second thing is that the issues we were confronting were just mesmerizing, sometimes overwhelming and complex. And there was a multiplicity of potential intervention points. So it was really hard to analyze. What we arrived at is that the differentiating factor was the partner. You can actually track your partner, whether it is an issue where you're observing that there if we only had a partner that did this, or if we only had a partner that reduced this kind of risk or did this and the other. So the differentiating factor was the partner. Somebody told us, you know, what you're doing is you're learning from the investment world, which is, they have a motto, which is invest in the partner and not the idea. The idea will evolve over time. You can actually pivot, but invest in your partner. That is the long-term relationship and focus on that. What that brought to us for implementation, that initial inception phase, was a lot of riches, and it had a lot of programming implications for us. First off, we had to throw out the traditional approach and rethink how to best support these partners to experiment, learn, and adapt over time. And secondly, if we wanted to actually do that, we needed to move away from negotiating a pre-baked idea, which is usually the relationship with partners. The pre-baked idea can either be the programs or USAID's, or it could be theirs. But the relationship and the dialogue is, we have a pre-baked idea, and I'm going to hold you accountable for implementing that idea. That is a very narrow view. And we wanted to expand on from that, and we wanted to try something different. In practice, it looks like we have three distinct modalities for procurement. And what I'm going to discuss is the procurement instrument that we're using. The first kind of modality is a light touch. Sorry, I'm not. All right. So the first kind of modality is the light touch. It's a low risk. It's accompaniment, we call it, where you accompany your partner along a path where you're just working together towards a common goal. This, for example, just to illustrate, we have a partnership with the Central Bank of Honduras. They made a pledge in early 2019 to the general public and to the president himself to modernize finances in Honduras. They said, we're going to bring financial technology. It's going to be the year of fintech in Honduras. Fantastic, but they didn't have a plan. It was an honest pledge. It was not lack of planning either. It was just an intention to bring modernization in Honduras. We started discussing, and they said, would you like to be part of it? Of course, this is a systemic change that we would like to be behind. We started financing a workshop, and they financed the second workshop. We started exploring and mapping who's doing fintech in Honduras, who's demanding fintech, who should be the actors, and so on and so forth. And the relationship evolves from that. Sometimes you fund a workshop, sometimes you co-fund a consultant, sometimes you start meeting on a regular basis, and the relationship evolves from that. This modality works best when you're not quite sure about the partner, and not because it has intrinsic weaknesses. It's just because you're not sure whether you have the right partner, like Luca and Marcos were saying. Maybe you initiate the relationship with that partner, but then later on you need to bring another partner, or you both need to decide something else. The second modality is a direct alliance. And a classic example of this in Honduras is our partnership, our alliance with Co-Hondu Cafe and Nestle, the Nestle company. Co-Hondu Cafe is the largest coffee exporter in Honduras, and we're doing two things together. One is youth microenterprise training, and the second is solar drying techniques. Both, very much needed in the sector, and et cetera. This is the case where you want to incrementally fund an idea towards a suite of targets and goals and whatnot. This works best when you are absolutely sure that you have the right partner, that you have somebody who's leading in the industry, who has the influence enough, and who has even funding power to make the changes. This is the case where we came up with the market actor co-creation umbrella instrument. We call it the MACU. And in order to come up with this instrument, we looked a lot into different examples we had in ACDA Boca, other projects, other USAID experiences. We reached out to Luca and we looked at the instruments they're using in Innova. We adapted that to the realities in Honduras, and We're using this as an IDIQ type of instrument that allows you to incrementally fund different types of instruments. This alliance that I just mentioned with Nestle and Conde du Café is using two types of instruments. One is to give in-kind grants, the solar dryers, and the other one is for the training, which is a direct grant. That instrument is really flexible, and it allows you to evaluate over time, make adaptations, and continue with the next phase. The third modality that we're using, and we need to pay attention to this one, is multi-stakeholder alliance. This, for example, is when you need to bring multiple partners, private sector firms, public sector firms, other donors and whatnot. A classic example of this is we're supporting the government of Honduras to train and place youth in the cruise ship industry. Turns out that the government of Honduras had made an alliance with the Florida Caribbean Cruise Association for thousands of jobs, but they just needed to start with to issue a law to set up the training facility and so on and so forth. Of course, we're partnering with the Ministry of Labor there, but we also needed to bring in the Ministry of Tourism. So two agencies within the government. We needed to bring in the Merchant Marine Service in Honduras for the appropriate seafarer trainers. But we also needed to bring in the vocational training agency in Honduras for the hospitality part of the training. We needed to bring other types of actors, including even the consular section of the embassy, because seafarers will touch ports in the United States and they need a special type of visa. This is a multi-stakeholder alliance. We're thinking now, after a year and a half of implementation, we're learning that this might be the type of partnership that we want all of our partnerships to escalate and evolve to, for several reasons. One is, this is the type of alliance that reflects the system better. Think about this alliance that I just mentioned. If not 100%, at least 95% of the actors involved in this subsystem are represented there. So it's the system acting. Therefore, automatically, USAID is a minority donor, which is exactly what we want to make reality on the private sector engagement plan and journey to self-reliance and whatnot. The second is that it's especially valuable for private sector actors. Private sector firms will tend to partner with USAID because we bring the reliable partner. Okay, so I'm going to make an intervention in this because only if USAID intervenes. But in addition to that, if we bring another minister, another donor or something like that, it's highly valuable for the trust that it generates. And lastly, it's the one possibility to actually experiment with actors that don't necessarily want to receive direct funding from USAID. Private sector firms or government entities will say, look, I'd love to participate, but I don't want to receive your funding. I don't want to learn a whole body of regulation or even vocabulary or just get messy with managing USAID funds, but I want to be part of the alliance. I want to do my part. So it has a lot of characteristics that is telling us that we certainly want our alliances to evolve towards this modality. A few examples of how this is moving away from the transactional relationship. Not all co-creation is about funding. As I said, the example with the Central Bank of Honduras. There's not always funding involved, so long as we are clear on the targets, on the transforming changes that we want to implement together. B, there's no pitch element. The partner is not selling us something by presenting a proposal to a call for proposals. They don't need to do the sort of quote unquote hypocrisy of selling us an idea. If we're clear on the systemic change that we want to implement, we both will be transparent in terms of what needs to be done, who needs to put money. You don't have enough, we don't have enough, let's find another partner. But it's just a very honest relationship. It's also moving away from the transactional relationship because it elevates the role of the partner to be continuous. I hear a lot of instances where people call co-creation what is really co-design. It's an instance where you call a partner and you co-designing. The co-creation ends. Somebody was telling us today, I'm just coming out of a co-creation with this and this and that partner. So co-creation for us is the actual implementation. You're creating where you're implementing, and the partner, so long as they're part of that, they're part of co-creation all along. Co-creation doesn't stop, right? And thirdly, it's moving away from the transactional relationship because the partner is not distracted from their core business. As I said, they don't need to learn necessarily a whole body of language, regulation, and systems. They need to focus on what they do best, creating jobs. And that's what we want them to excel at. We'll manage the other part of the bureaucracy. And lastly, one message that co-creation and market systems is not just agriculture. I just mentioned policy, I just mentioned tourism, I just mentioned other types of activities that are very much a market systems implementation approach.
Okay, thank you. And we will move into now the Q&A portion of this panel. And of course, we have questions coming in online. Please type those in the chat box. And for those of you in the room, we're going to kind of go back and forth from online questions and in the room questions. I think for me, taking away a couple highlights here, you know, really thinking about, are we finding the disruptors and not just any old partner to say we have a partnership? Are we prepared to support business pivots? I don't think we really ever talk about this. I think that's something we need to think hard about. And I really like this idea of, you know, rather than always having a one-to-one partnership mental model or engagement mental model, how do we graduate more things to a multi-stakeholder engagement situation? Because you're right, that ultimately that is how these systems function. And if we're talking about sustainable situations in the long run, that is where we need to be headed. So great value up here. I guess I will ask one initial question. So I think it's interesting to think about something that you said, Marcos, has come up in a couple conversations now, where from a traditional view, when we think about creating a good engagement with the private sector, there's kind of that Venn diagram of USAID and the private sector. And that middle portion is the shared value that we're striving to achieve. Where what we're looking at here is just throwing that out the window. And USAID is not part of that Venn diagram. It is the private sector and the community where we want to see the development impact happen. And the shared value is that intersection where USAID is behind trying to facilitate that to happen. So I'd be interested in just hearing a little bit more from any of you that would like to comment on how do you shift to that mindset? Because when people hear private sector engagement, it's immediately that USAID private sector Venn diagram. So how do you break that?
Thank you for a very interesting question. I think, Sergio, you also touched upon this a lot. And, you know, at the beginning, YLA precisely thought that the way to engage private sector would be, you know, what we've typically done time over time is ask private sector, send us your idea. Yes, that might work. Sometimes you might have some interesting, innovative ideas, but again, it's when you set the tone that way, you're actually, again, setting yourselves up for USAID. The project is in the front seat and not necessarily the partner. So how do you take that step back is and this for me, I think in our activity was the hardest part is how do you ask the relevant questions to the private sector and who asks those questions? And how can I empower my staff to be able to ask the same questions? How can I make them overnight see what I see in private sector engagement? Because I have to rely precisely on the capacity of everybody on the team being the sniffer. So sniffing for opportunity. How do you find opportunity? How do you find the private sector partner? That's definitely takes a lot of hits and misses. But it actually flips around at one stage of the game when you are actually able to open the dialogue with private sector and let them actually see you as a facilitator and stop this dialogue of, oh, I'll come to you because you're the funder. And when you ask private sector questions that actually hit upon why they need to focus on this, and I'll just give you an example, is that the common denominator is when you hit the ground is you're the cash cow. So everybody comes to you thinking that that's what is going to happen, is you're going to finally get a grant or funded to do that, X, Y, Z. And the typical story is I've been in business for 10 years. And when you ask them, so what you've shared with me, that is the problem, that for the past 10 years, this has been holding you back. As you've described it, I can't believe that for 10 years you were waiting for USAID to come to solve your problem. So we need to actually be able to ask, is this the problem? Is this what really is holding you back? And when you actually challenge and are receptive to listening, I think that's the entry point to kind of start shifting the mindset of how you work with private sector. Secondly is time. We need to take a step back, and I'm glad that we've all touched upon it, is this quick in, quick out approach. If we're actually going to be able to actually solve what's holding you back, it can't be something that's going to take 18 months. And I'm not saying that there aren't problems that don't take that time frame, but where we can add value and get private sector to actually own it is to paying attention precisely on that, is where we can add value needs to be these things that in a shorter time period, we can actually see the change. And that actually leads to your next pivot. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of opportunities, but if you break it into smaller chunks and work with private sector, you have a better chance of mitigating risk, of focusing and helping build the right partnership relationship so that they understand that we'll be there, but we're not just going to give you a blank check. We want to work with you and actually see results and have an opportunity to pivot much faster. And because they're always pivoting. So we as an activity, have a better chance of participating in the partnership making process.
Thank you. If I can add to that, Christine, I'm trying to articulate a couple of ideas. One is, so we're trying to mimic the private sector, right? The private sector would make decisions on a partnership on an instant. When they see the opportunity, they grab it. As well as when they see signals that this partnership is not working and it's causing loss, they cut it. So we're trying to mimic that. I'm wondering, in that space, the sniffing around constantly for opportunities is a key critical factor. We need to be, promoting that. I'm wondering to what extent that bores a hole into the procurement regulation and competition regulations, for example. And that's not to say that the contractual and legal implications, such as a technical description, a grant document, and so on and so forth, are not present in what we do. They're very much present, but they're a secondary thought. They are a byproduct. The primary thought is there's an opportunity, we need to grab it, and we need to be focused not on the legal language of our relationship, but in what we're trying to achieve. So that mindset, that change in mindset is really where the paths cross. And you can easily go one route where the legal language and the articles of the relationship are more important, or you focus entirely on the objective and the change that you want to promote. And I guess striking a balance between the two is the key. But we're learning.
Do I have time? I just want to say two things very quickly. So first, on those Venn diagrams, I think business as the priority. So identifying where the value is for business to go is the subject of the matter when you discuss with the private sector. And the first step sometimes is to build that awareness. So that means that we need to have tools and the capacity to go to the field, do action learning as quickly as possible, not necessarily through negotiating work plans or approval. So, for example, we are working with a large supermarket to start tapping into the domestic market and sell made in Mozambique products, because we know that that gets a premium in urban areas. There's a cuisine culture in Mozambique to some extent compared to other African countries, and there's a premium there. So the action research is, let's grab a flight, let's go together and see whether there are products you could source and what are the quantities, prices. Let's figure that out together without a lot of thinking. Yeah. And then another thing I wanted to also say is that, going back to my points that I was making during the presentation, I do think that co-creation is about, besides solving problems, which I think is important, but I think that the main point is that co-creation is about reimagining things. You are operating with private sector operators that do their business day to day. They know their business. They know where the money is coming from. But you are bringing in, helping them to rethink and identify new pathways that can lead them to either faster growth or more resources, more success. So I think the capacity of providing that, which Marcos refers to as value addition, like the capacity of being an agent of change, ignition, I think is very important.
Okay, great. I'm going to take a couple questions from the online audience, and then we'll go to in the room. So think about what you might want to ask. So we've got a question from Joanne Sonneschein about partner identification. So maybe if you can get a little more specific about what criteria you're using to find the right partner, because it's not always about who has worked on these issues before or is currently, but how do you really evaluate that partnership? You know, when it's, we've talked about moving on if it's not the right thing, which you should, but what are the criteria you're using for that? And then also a question from Roy, just looking at, you know, what is kind of the ideal duration of these relationships, and, you know, in terms of how long might you invest in this partnership, in this engagement?
If you don't mind, I'll take this first very quickly. So how do I identify partners? The way we have been doing it since the very beginning is very simple, on a 2x2 matrix. Is this a good idea? Is this a good partner? And a good partner just means is a partner that is willing to put some resources, that is driven by some level of entrepreneurial drive. So if it scores yes, it's a no-brainer. We start engaging as quickly as possible through those action research or early engagements that are take less risk for us, but allows us to develop that idea further. If some of these is unclear, that means we're going to sit and develop and learn more. If it's a no, it just means it's not worth engaging. So it's just a quickly management decision matrix. But I want to make a point that for me is more relevant, is that the longer the age of the project, the better the project is at identifying partners. And we should not underestimate this in the life of a project when we are at the design. Not only because you learn which ones are the good partners and which ones are not, but primarily because your vision about how the market system can change develops and evolves. So you have a much better vision. I personally have a much better vision at year 3 of how I see the input distribution market change or the supply chain market change, given the actors that are playing, the willingness to change, the opportunities that they've seen, that knowledge guides me towards engaging with certain types of actors versus others, because I know I'm going to get more bang for my bucks in terms of real change. So I think that is a knowledge that every time we start from scratch, we toss away. Like every time we go through the 5 years cycle, in a country where you have agricultural cycles once a year, so you have one opportunity to learn a year. You know, if you have a 5 years project, you kind of have 3 opportunities to learn, because the first year you're doing your program documents, and the last year you're closing up.
I just want to add to that. I think, Luca, you've hit it on right on the spot. And I think, describing the normal project cycle, I think we all have learned exactly the same thing is right when you figure things out and you have momentum, in an instant, it's time to shut it down. And it's almost like we don't want to learn. We want to design new. So we say we want to learn, and we say we want to take those lessons and fold them into new design, but it's always new. It's not necessarily, and I think that's critical of actually a system is understanding that it is a huge investment to find the right partner, and I think that's the biggest. There's not one recipe of finding the right partner. It does take a lot of hit and misses, and it takes exactly that. It's a time factor for when your staff understand how to sniff better. Giving them tools to do that also helps and is an establishing processes, and that's something that we worked to actually make this criteria and the duration actually play out. Is I basically asked everybody on our team to say, you are actually a salesperson out there looking for opportunity, but I need to see it. You can't tell me week after week, I'm working on it. And when I ask you, well, so how long are you going to hone into an opportunity so that we know that we actually can work? The typical answer is 2 weeks. Okay, 2 week is a kind of a magical time frame that multiplies by 2 each time, and you're still in the same phase of the partnership making deal. So giving our staff tools where the process, and I told them is one thing that we all do on every activity is we network. We meet and we meet and we meet and we take notes in a notebook, and we fill 10,000 notebooks of notes. But when you want to find that information and make that information relevant as to, I met somebody. You actually don't have an organized system of actually managing, as a salesperson should do, is managing your contact and the reason why you met. So having a process in place to do that. Our criteria was very simple, is if we can identify private sector that needs to engage youth, not that wants to show us what they can do so that we can measure, is I need to understand, why do you need to engage youth? And that helps me ask the question, all right, so what's holding you back? So that's where the game changer starts.
And just very shortly, to the point of the ideal partner, I bet you the partner that you meet in day one will be a better partner in year 2 and a great partner in year 4. So you don't find the ideal partner. You find a partner, and as I said at the beginning, you commit to that partner and you evolve over time together. And the second thing is to the point on how do we identify partners. You don't go out seeking partners. You go out seeking opportunities, as Marcos and Luca pointed out. You go out seeking opportunities such as, Honduras doesn't have a regulation on fintech. That is an opportunity for us. And whether we have one partner or multiple partners, it'll be a matter of just the architecture of how we do this.
Okay, let's take maybe 3 questions, and if you can state your name.
Good day, everyone. Mary Beggs from Cardno. Thanks for this great presentation so far. So in addition to famous Venn diagrams, there's a tendency for us to rush towards dollars, leveraged, and ratios in terms of measuring private sector partnerships, which is obviously really important, but there's also a lot more that the private sector has to offer. So Sergio, I was really pleased when you said co-creation is not just about funding. So I wonder, what are some of the other attributes or indicators that you all are using to measure successful partnerships and track them during implementation? Sorry, glad I was first.
I'm Peter Boone from Palladium, and I'm very interested in all of the discussions today. The discussion around selection of partners came up in all of our presentations, and there was a certain amount of emphasis on disruptors and things like that, which could be a positive or it could be a negative. it's kind of like a Silicon Valley type term, but I think when we're anxious sometimes to get onto the new bandwagons of and terminology, we don't want to leave out some of the things that have been really important to us for years, like not being a disruptor, being a reliable partner, a trustworthy partner. What we're trying for in a lot of cases is more structured and transparent and fair trade and willingness to pay premiums and sharing value within value chain. So I think we shouldn't rush to really quick definitions, and I think we want to think about some broader characteristics, which I'm sure all of you are using in your selection. It's a question and a comment, but I think some of those other value attributes that I mentioned are very important to us in these partnerships.
One more question in the room.
Thanks. I'm Megan Bolden from Market Share Associates. A question kind of related to something Sergio brought up about looking at like how we're pitching. It's not asking them to pitch us. There's no pitch, but there kind of is a pitch to some extent, I think, for why they should work with us. And so Marcus mentioned the matchmaking. So you all were talking about failing fast. My question is about how do you break up when you fail, and do you break up, and what are the terms of the breakup?
Who would like to start?
So how do you measure success? We tend to try to keep it simple. And when working with private sector, the one thing that in a way is a criteria that I won't call it a criteria, but it's a goal more than a criteria to actually be able to make sure that we can open the dialogue along the same terms. And that's kind of the biggest shift is, can you stop seeing the USAID logo on me first? And let's pay attention to what are your drivers for success? Not my drivers, but what are your drivers? And one of the common things that we found, again, was when we had a chance to actually help private sector think about the fact that what I am really interested is, I'm interested in their success. I need to be worried about my project success. That's none of your business. I can take care of that. And I think, Sergio, you alluded to that as well, is that's my job. But where we really can work together is in focusing your business success and applying your business performance indicators and letting those business indicators speak to my contractual indicators. There definitely requires a lot of flexibility also in dialogue with USAID so that we can simplify what we measure and not force onto our partners a whole bunch of metrics that are good to know, but not necessarily apply to business success. And that's where, the flexibility comes into place. How can we simplify that process so that we can let private sector do what they know how to do, run a business? And how can we jump on that wagon effectively to know how to add value to that equation? I think there was something that you were talking about, the disruptors, and Sergio also, I think, built upon that, is partnerships are not a two-way street between the project and one set of businesses. It is actually the ability to open up that stakeholder relationship into more than one. And while we are trying to shift this mindset, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that other activities, donors, projects don't necessarily kind of think along the same lines, which is a disruptor too, where the incentives that we are trying to actually put on the table are actually being completely distorted by somebody else. And when that happens, you just don't necessarily shut the door, you actually open the door. That's your next partner opportunity, that is for me to actually walk into that other project and saying, listen, we need to partner, because the reality is When there are so many donor efforts focused in one area, we're stumbling upon the same partner over and over. And our private sector partners know that. So what they're talking to me, they're talking to Sergio, but totally along different lines. But when Sergio and I can talk and actually unmask that part, we can turn that and actually to a value add proposition and switch this conversation of leveraging at a whole different level, where we actually can show the partner is we do want to leverage what you're putting on the table, but you cannot just, repeat the same thing you told me and to Sergio. We want to maximize where both of us as partners with you can add value.
True. Also, that question on how do you measure that, that is an ongoing and very active discussion space. And there are a lot of thought leaders discussing complexity measurement and so on. We are doing our part. Our MEL plan is just revolutionary the way we see it. We're really part of a lot of discussion forums on that, and we're trying sentinel indicators, for example, where you have a glimpse that the path of the changes are going in the right direction, and we do quality assessments where we're asking the partners whether did our intervention really compel you to make institutional changes or changes in your industry and whatnot. So that is a very active and evolving discussion right now, and we're trying to do our part in bringing some evidence. On the value added attributes of partners, I think I would only add to what Marcos said, that we look for power and interest. There's nothing like a committed partner to work with. They can have inherent weaknesses and they can have limitations, but those are solvable to the extent that they have a lot of commitment to really be part of it, put skin in the game, and just work with you. And lastly, how do you break up? There's not a nice way, but this market actor co-creation umbrella instrument allows for breathing spaces, pause and reflect instances, and precisely when you're going to switch from one instrument to the next, the logical evolution, you have a lot of opportunities to assess and say, look, this is not working for us, and you have to be absolutely transparent. We're going to leave it at this. We thank you very much for your participation. We're just going to continue by ourselves.
Yeah, just very briefly on the indicators. Our MEL plan is also very revolutionary. I think we all enjoy our MEL plans, but we have all sorts of sentinel indicators. We look at market system health. It's very qualitative in nature, and as I said, the number of relationships, the quality of the relationships, the number of times the company improves, whether there's change before and after it met cross path with the project, and so on. So for us, it's very important. I guess the point here is that that's not really the stuff we sell back to USAID, because it's very difficult to explain, and there's always suspicion behind a lot of words and blah blah. And at the end of the day, a number seems to be more sincere, and therefore the feed the future indicators tend to be quite number driven. So I guess it's a blessing and a curse in the sense that to some extent is manageable if your relationship with the counterpart in the mission is sensible, and you can set reasonable targets that you can measure within your pilots. You have contributed, and then you can do the more intellectual part as what really drives your strategic vision. But I do think that there's space for improvement in that area. The last thing I want to say is about disruptors, and so obviously after 4 years of Mozambique, I'm coming very much from that perspective, and it's not necessarily the truth for every other country. But in a country that is it's a country where the market is very thin. You have a few market actors, and transactions tend to be spot. They're not repeated, and they don't build value over time. So being a disruptor actually means to change that way of doing business. It means to establish a relationship with your suppliers, if they are the smallholder farmers, that is growth oriented and is going to be repeated over time. And that's the measure of the quality of the relationship. And that's why it's important to measure that. So that's what disruptor is for us.
Megan, to your question also is a wrong partnership or a partnership not going sour also does not happen overnight. So the ability of us to actually help the partner see why they're failing and share that common work plan is the best tool to actually drive that decision and saying, look, unless we're seeing things differently, but we've agreed to share a common work plan. And you don't find out 6 months all of a sudden that the relationship is not going in the right direction.
Since Marcos had 2 opportunities, why not? Also, just to add to that, pilot first. We piloted. Thank you very much. It was nice. We have a learning. If a pilot is 6 months or so, you will know if it's a good relationship or not.
I can go a third time if you want.
Okay, so back to our online audience. Gary Alex posed an initial question, which apparently several people are interested in, as am I. So thinking about private sector engagement, from the donor perspective, we're interested, and Gary, I'm going to paraphrase for you, interested in public good, of course. So how, given that the private sector partners are motivated by their profits, presumably, but an increase in their profit doesn't necessarily benefit society, doesn't necessarily engage youth or the poor and reach these vulnerable populations that we have the development interest in. So how do you navigate this issue of public good contribution in these private sector co-creations?
Can I take that? So first, an apology is that I tend to speak a lot about the private sector, but that's because our project is particularly focused on it. But taking our partners could be partners with government, partners could be with public institutions, universities. We do partner with a number of universities, but we find ourselves in a position where there's other DI implemented projects that are particularly focused on business environment, and we are co-located in the same office, and it's to steer from the mission to kind of box issues with one project or another project. And so at times we are limited in what we can do in the public space. So, but the point I wanted to make is that, so first, partnership does not mean only partner with the private sector in terms of the public good. And the second point is that private sector, well, the private sector engagement strategy says so, and it's commonly accepted in this environmental cultural environment, that private sector generates value and then gives opportunities can provide opportunities for all the members of society to participate and benefit from that value. So I guess the point is that the project, we engage in a partnership only if we see that that partnership takes us on a path of inclusivity and a shift in the balance of power as well between the smallholder farmers and the other market actors, because the market actors become disruptive in seeing the strategic value of continuing to work with the smallholder farmers. And just to conclude, we've been very lucky because in Mozambique there's been a financial crisis, and the money and the amount of money spent on public subsidies for the agriculture has decreased, and that has made a few companies realize that there's unpredictability on public funding. So it may be a good business opportunity, that's what drives my business, but there's high risks involved. So to be a first mover and establish a solid base working with the bottom of the pyramid instead mitigates my risks, and because it's a more stable source of income. So there's a strategic element value of, if you segment the market, you don't need to make money everywhere at all the times, but you are diversifying your risk and you're having a strategic perspective vision of what you're doing. So.
Time. We're in a race against time constantly. So what comes first? So yes, when you're working with private sector, obviously their bottom line tends to be the first item. But when you actually move past, that set of holdbacks of getting the business structure right, you then have, like Sarah was saying, is hold on to your partner to actually start talking about these other things that are actually relevant to the private sector. Private sector does not exist in a vacuum. They're not a thing. They exist in a community. They invest in the community where the public aspect of their relationship should be relevant. So helping them when they're ready and dosifying that is start talking to private sector about these things when they're receptive listeners, when they can start seeing the value add of those propositions. And just a clear example is a business that through our investment grows exponentially. And we've got several examples, all of us, where, we started in year one, like with a seed, company in Uganda. By year three, what was a small mom and pop shop, all of a sudden has 7 warehouses spread out through several areas of Uganda. But when you ask that business partner is what made you invest in infrastructure and in the growth of the business, and have you thought about who's going to work for you? Where is that workforce coming? And if you're working in youth, how are you investing in the next generation of your workforce? That kid who is 10 years old, within the next 5 years will be 15. Odds are, because you're not on the right path to success, those that work for you are not going to be there either. So it could happen that you're going to be inciting on or contributing to that kid dropping out of school and not completing the necessary education to build his skill set up so that they're of value to you 10 years down the road. So your return on investment is paying attention to giving the right signals to youth, to those parents who actually have that kid as a 10-year-old, to actually understand how you're connected to the community and how you can actually start now investing and how we can use that pivot as an opportunity to add value to that equation as well. But you need more time.
Absolutely true. 3 elements here. One is, yes, to the extent that they're growing, they're generating investment and jobs, no matter what. Even in, it's only natural that they will create jobs, and livelihoods is what we want for people. You can actually engage them in a more conscious conversation later on. That's true. But the second thing is new entrepreneurs, especially young entrepreneurs, they're conscious themselves from the get-go. The new generations of entrepreneurs are conscious with the environment, with society, with whatnot. So they're bringing that element to us, in fact. So that's a realization. And thirdly, in the end, they have their bottom line. You need to state your bottom line as well. If there is a business idea, like we found, we had a proposal in Honduras actually to fund a movie production company and whatnot. It was beautiful. It was just actually transformative in the social side. But our bottom line was just prevailed, and we could not fund that because it was not a job generation activity.
I didn't take it before. Yeah. There's another thing because that I think is interesting, and I would like to bring to your attention is that sometimes when I find myself talking to my colleagues in the business practice where we are, there's a tension, particularly when the other side comes from a technical solution angle. There's a tension in the discussion because in the way I'm developing the distribution of the input segment, the input function in Mozambique, for example, I'm not so much interested into what technological solution the distributor is going to bring. I'm interested in giving access and an affordable price, starting from this market segment that we are targeting. So something that market segment can afford, that is a step up from their current condition, and is not necessarily the best technical solution. It's not necessarily going to be the best seed variety. It's not going to be. So obviously, the dark side of this is that the private sector has the power to sell stuff that is adulterated, or that. So you think systemically, and you want to build the feedbacks in the system as much as you can, so that in this case, the smallholder farmers as a consumer has recursive measures, But what I'm saying, there's a lot of tension between the technological, technocratic solution and a more systemic solution, if you want, that is affordable and gets you on a path of growth.
Great. Okay, sadly, we are at the end of our time for part one of this event, but I think that we have heard a lot of really interesting, thought-provoking things that we will be able to carry forward into part two or into hopefully our work for those of us joining online. One additional comment on this measurement question, and I think particularly where we're looking at private sector engagement and co-creation within a market systems development space, it is really critical that we move away from measuring the inputs, which is the leverage and the dollars and the number of partnerships, to really thinking about how are we measuring the outcomes. What are the results that we want to see in this market system for which we think that this engagement is going to contribute, and is it contributing to those results? That is the measurement we should be after. But of course, someone at USAID will always ask you what the leverage is. I don't think that's going to go away. So for those of you online, please, if you have any lingering questions that you haven't already typed into the chat box, please do so. We will capture those and attempt to do some written responses after the fact, as is our usual practice. And for those of you in the room, we have an opportunity to do the same. So there are evaluation forms on each table, and there's a section on that form. If you have a remaining question, please write it down there, and we will capture that and add them to our chat box lingering questions. So with that, thank you to our panelists for your insights, and to the audience online and in the room for your great questions. Goodbye to our online friends until our next webinar. And for those with us in the room, we will attempt to take a quick 15-minute break. There's some food outside. The restrooms are over in that direction. And then after which we will commence our roundtable conversations. When you come back, if you are currently sitting with people that you work with regularly, please try to sit with people you don't. I think it'll make for a richer conversation. But thank you very much.